Good evening, my dear listener. Tonight, I invite you to travel far back in time, to a summer nearly 1,000 years ago, when the air over the Norman lands carried not the scent of victory, but the heavy, nauseating stench of decay. It is a story about a man who once believed he had conquered the world, a man whose name was whispered in both awe and fear across kingdoms, a man who built empires out of blood and fire, and who, in the end, discovered that no crown could command the slow betrayal of his own flesh. This is the death of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, the King of England, and the mortal whose final days became a lesson whispered through the centuries, reminding every soul that pride and power are nothing against the quiet patience of death. In the late summer of the year 1087, within the thick stone walls of a monastery in Rouen, a foul odour began to seep through the corridors. At first, the monks believed a dead animal had been trapped beneath the floors, or that some forgotten grave had been disturbed. But as the hours passed, the smell only grew stronger, thicker, and darker, not the simple smell of death, but of something still alive, something rotting from within. Behind the closed doors of a candlelit chamber, the mighty king, who had once crossed the channel and seized an entire kingdom, lay in agony, his enormous body swelling and decaying even as he still drew breath. He was not dying from a sword wound or an arrow, not from battle nor betrayal, but from something far smaller, far crueler, the slow infection of his own body, spreading like punishment through his veins. The story of how it came to this began weeks earlier, when William, then nearly 60 years old, but still driven by his pride, rode at the head of his army in France. He had laid siege to the town of Mantes after a cruel insult from the French king, who mocked the conqueror's growing size, saying he looked more like a pregnant woman than a warrior. The jest struck deeper than any blade could, and William, consumed by fury, swore that fire would answer mockery. And so he rode through burning streets, his armoured body gleaming in the flames, his soldiers slaughtering and burning, his pride blazing brighter than the city he destroyed. But as he guided his horse through the smoke and rubble, fate struck him in silence. The horse reared suddenly, and the heavy iron pommel of the saddle crushed into his swollen abdomen. The pain that tore through him was sharp and deep, like a hidden curse taking hold. He straightened, tried to command his men to continue, but the pain would not leave. It followed him back to his tent, to his litter, and finally to the bed in Rouen where it would end him. In the dim chamber of the monastery, he lay surrounded by priests, attendants, and the few loyal servants who still dared to stay. But as the days passed, their courage weakened, not because of fear of the man, but because of the smell of what he was becoming. His belly swelled grotesquely, his skin turning first red, then purple, then black in patches. Beneath the surface, unseen and unstoppable, infection was devouring him. The conqueror of kingdoms was being conquered by something no army could fight. Even as he prayed for mercy, his own flesh was falling away. The monks came with herbs soaked in vinegar, pressing them to their faces as they whispered prayers. Yet still, they gagged and fled from the chamber, crossing themselves as if warding off evil. The air itself seemed cursed, and the room, once filled with the light of candles and gold, became a pit of darkness and despair. There was a terrible poetry in it all. For decades, William had commanded with cruelty, burning villages, crushing rebellions, and bending thousands of lives to his will. Now, the world was bending him in return. He had built his reign on the suffering of others, and now he was learning, through the pain of every breath, what that suffering meant. Each hour became a confession. Each night a slow descent into something beyond pain, an understanding that no man, however great, can rule over his own flesh when death begins to claim it piece by piece. And though the priests reminded him of divine forgiveness, though he clutched at the cross and begged for peace, he knew within that this death was not random, not cruel chance, but judgment. Outside, the summer sun blazed on the monastery roofs, and the people of Rouen spoke in hushed voices about the king's condition. They did not pray for his recovery. Many remembered the hunger and the burned fields of the north, the ruined villages, the families who had perished under his soldiers' torches. The conqueror's pain, to them, was justice made visible, a divine balancing of the scales. And yet, even as they spoke of his punishment, they felt the chill of fear, for if such a man, crowned and chosen, could die so miserably, what hope was there for anyone else? Inside the chamber, the sound of his groans echoed like waves against stone. Sometimes he tried to speak of his past, of his sons who quarreled over his realm, of his enemies who waited for his final breath. He asked for forgiveness for his cruelty, for his pride, for the campaign that had starved the north of England, but his words came out in gasps, carried on the foul air that even the candles seemed to fear. As he lay there, his empire began to crumble without him. Servants slipped away with his treasures. Priests came and went in haste. The few who stayed whispered that they could see the shadow of death sitting at the foot of his bed, patient and unblinking. And then there came a night when he awoke screaming. He claimed to see soldiers burning in the darkness, their faces twisted like wax in the fire. The very same men he had condemned decades before. He said they were calling him to join them. The monks who tended him fled once again, leaving the king alone with his visions. The conqueror who had once stood at the center of history was now reduced to a solitary figure in a dark room, surrounded not by courtiers and generals, but by the smell of his own decay. It is said that as dawn approached, he tried to raise his hands to pray, but they were too heavy. He whispered the name of the Virgin, and in that whisper, his voice broke. The conqueror who had ruled through iron and fear finally surrendered not to man, not to rebellion, but to the quiet and merciless certainty of death. The bells of Rouen rang that morning for prayer, and as they did, the monks found the chamber still. The candles had burned low, the air was thick and unbearable, and on the bed, the body of William the Conqueror, the man who had shaped nations, built fortress, and ruled through terror, lay silent, bloated, and broken. So begins our tale. My friend, not of his victories, but of his defeat, not of battles won, but of the slow unmaking of a man who believed himself untouchable. In the nights to come, we will walk through the echoes of that death, through the betrayal that followed, the chaos of his funeral, the explosion that emptied a church, and the centuries of shame that turned a king's name into a warning. But for now, let us end this first night with a single truth whispered through time, that all empires, all crowns, all kings must one day learn what William learned too late, that power rots, that pride decays, and that the body of even the mightiest will one day betray the soul that commands it. Good evening again. My friend, tonight, we return to the story that began in fire and ended in rot, to the man whose pride brought him both a crown and a curse. The tale of William the Conqueror cannot be told through glory alone, for the roots of his downfall were not born in the monastery where he died, but years earlier, when anger became the language of his soul. Pride is the shadow that follows power, and in William's life, that shadow grew so long it swallowed him whole. To understand the horror of his death, we must first walk back through the smoke and ashes of the moment that cursed him, the burning of the French town that mocked his pride and set his fate ablaze. It was the summer of the year, 1087, when the fields were green and the rivers full, and yet the land of Mantes burned like a furnace. The French king, Philip I, had spoken words that no warrior could bear. He had laughed at William's growing body, saying the great conqueror was so swollen with age and indulgence that he looked ready to give birth rather than ride to war. Those words, carried by messengers and echoed in whispers, struck at the one weakness William could never ignore: his vanity. He had conquered kingdoms, crushed rebellions, and made his name eternal. Yet still the laughter of one man could undo him. Rage became his only answer. William ordered his troops to march, his banners to rise, and his swords to draw. The town of Mantes, innocent of the insult, stood in his path like an offering to his fury. Smoke rose before dawn as soldiers torched the fields, and the smell of burning grain carried for miles. Women cried from the rooftops as their houses caught fire, and men who tried to fight were cut down where they stood. William rode among them, a heavy figure wrapped in armor, his face red from the heat, his eyes cold as iron. He had built his empire through terror, and now, once more, he reminded the world that the conqueror's anger was fire itself. But fate is not moved by rage, nor does it care for royal vengeance. As William's horse stepped over the ruins, its hooves striking embers and broken wood, something happened, something small, unseen, and irreversible. Perhaps the horse was startled by the falling of a burning beam. Perhaps its hoof slipped on the charred stones. Whatever the cause, the great animal reared, and William's massive body slammed forward against the iron pommel of the saddle. The sound was not loud, but deep. A dull thud like a drum struck beneath the skin. Pain surged through him, sudden and absolute, and he gasped, clutching his side. His men dismounted, rushing to him, but there was no blood to see, only his pale face and his trembling hands pressed against his belly. In that moment, the conqueror's destiny changed. He would not die on a battlefield, surrounded by banners and glory. He would die slowly, invisibly, undone, not by sword or rebellion, but by his own body, turning traitor within him. Yet no one knew it then. William refused to admit weakness. He ordered his men to continue the burning, declaring victory, his voice strained but defiant. But inside, something had torn, perhaps a ruptured organ, perhaps the beginning of the infection that would one day consume him. Every breath after that moment carried the seed of his destruction. When he returned to Rouen, he told no one of the pain. Only when he could no longer rise from his bed did he summon his physicians, who came with leeches, with herbs, with prayers whispered over his swollen body. But medicine in that age was blind against what lived unseen. The more they treated him, the worse he became. His belly grew round and tight as a drum. His skin stretched and discolored, and the odor that would one day drive men from the room began to bloom in the still air. What had begun in vengeance now blossomed into punishment. It was as if the flames of Mantes had turned inward, and the fire that had destroyed others was now devouring him. And still, the conqueror would not surrender. He gave orders from his bed, demanded reports of his sons, and commanded prayers for his soul. The monks who served him said he could barely breathe, that his voice broke when he spoke of England, of Normandy, of the empire he had carved from blood. They said his hands still clenched as if gripping a sword, even in fevered dreams. But there were also moments of silence, when his eyes would fix on nothing, and the man who had terrified nations seemed afraid at last. It was said that one night he wept quietly and confessed that he could no longer tell whether the pain in his body was punishment or mercy. As days passed, even his loyal attendants began to vanish. They blamed exhaustion, but it was fear that drove them, not fear of him, but of what he had become. The room was suffocating, the smell unbearable. Only the priests dared enter, and even they held cloths to their faces, murmuring prayers that sounded more like apologies. The king who had once commanded thousands now depended on the trembling hands of strangers. His crown lay on a table beside him, untouched, its gold dimmed by the smoke of the candles that never seemed to burn long enough. Al-Sudeh. The word spread that the conqueror was dying, and opportunists crept closer. Some came pretending loyalty. Others came to steal. The treasures that had filled his chamber began to vanish. One jeweled dagger, a chain of gold, a silver cup. The men who had once bowed before him now stepped over him to take what they desired. It was not rebellion, but decay made visible, the kingdom itself beginning to rot just as its king did. And William knew it. He saw them through half-closed eyes and said nothing, for his voice had lost its power, and no command could hold back the greed of those who had once feared him. That is how fate humbles kings, not in grand betrayals, but in quiet moments of abandonment. The conqueror, surrounded by his wealth, lay poorer than any peasant, stripped not of land or title, but of dignity. Each coin stolen, each servant who fled, was another fragment of his legacy turning to dust. Even the priests, who came to grant him absolution, hurried through their prayers, unable to stand the air for long. He was alone, truly alone, with only the slow rhythm of his own decaying breath to remind him he was still alive. And yet, through the pain and the silence, there was one truth that rose like a whisper through the darkness. Every flame he had ever lit, every act of cruelty, every life he had destroyed, had led him here to a room that smelled of rot and regret. His body was his punishment, and his punishment was the mirror of his soul. In that monastery, surrounded by shadows and the distant sound of bells, William the Conqueror was no longer a king. He was a man, undone by the very pride that had made him great. So as you drift tonight into the soft corners of sleep, remember the lesson hidden in his suffering, that the fire of anger burns not only what it touches, but also the heart that kindles it. Tomorrow night, we will follow the conqueror deeper into his final hours, when pain turned to terror, and the body that had once commanded armies began to rot openly before the eyes of those who dared to stay. But for now, close your eyes and let this story settle in the quiet of your thoughts. For every kingdom, every victory, every power must one day face the silence of its own decay, just as William did in that dark and airless chamber long ago. The monastery had grown quieter with each passing day, and within its cloistered walls, the smell of decay became a kind of language no one dared to speak. It clung to the stones and the wood of the doors, to the linen habits of the monks, to the air itself, until all who entered carried a trace of it back into the world beyond. The chamber of the dying king had become a place of exile, a kingdom reduced to a single bed, where the conqueror of England lay captive inside his own body. The sounds of the outside world, the bells, the chanting, the crows in the courtyard reached him like voices from another realm, and each one reminded him of the life that had already slipped beyond his reach. The servants who had once crowded around him, bowing, whispering, rushing to obey his slightest word, began to vanish as the odor thickened. At first they made excuses, claiming to fetch food or fetch priests, but soon their footsteps were gone altogether, and only the monks remained. Even they entered reluctantly, pressing cloths soaked in vinegar to their faces. muttering prayers not just for his soul but for their own courage to endure the stench. When they lifted the sheets to wash his body, they found the flesh soft and discolored, the skin splitting in places where the gases of infection pushed beneath it. It was as though the king's body no longer belonged to him, as though some unseen hand was sculpting him into a warning against pride. William knew what was happening, though no one dared describe it aloud. He could feel the swelling, the heat, the trembling pulse of rot moving through him. And sometimes he thought he could even smell himself. There were moments when he turned his head and saw the horror reflected in the eyes of those who tended him, not the reverence a king expects, but pity and dread. He tried to speak to them, to tell them not to be afraid, but his voice came as a rasping whisper, each word broken by pain. He spoke of Normandy, of the castles he had built, of the sea winds over Hastings, and of the crown that had once gleamed brighter than the sun. Yet all those memories seemed like shadows now, unreal, drifting away as his strength failed. At night the room grew unbearably still. The lamps guttered, their light trembling against the blackened walls, and the air grew so heavy that even breathing became a labor. Sometimes he called out, thinking someone stood at the foot of his bed, but the monks said it was only the flicker of candlelight casting shapes upon the wall. Yet William insisted he saw them faces of the men he had burned in the north. Children he had condemned to famine. Soldiers who had fallen screaming beneath his banners. They stood before him, silent, waiting, and when he reached for his sword, his hand found only air. In those long hours, the conqueror faced an army he could not fight. The monks began to record the strange things they witnessed. One wrote that when the king slept, he muttered words in a tongue no one knew, perhaps Latin twisted by fever, perhaps the language of dreams. Another swore that one night, when the bells tolled for midnight prayers, the flames of every candle in the room turned blue for a moment, and the air grew colder than stone. They took it as a sign that the devil had come to claim what was his, but others believed it was mercy, that God himself had entered the room to remind William that even the damned are not forgotten. Outside, word spread that the king was near death. Nobles gathered in Rouen, not to mourn, but to wait. Messengers rode between England and Normandy carrying secret letters, and already men spoke of the division of his lands. His sons, Robert, William Rufus, and Henry, moved like ghosts in separate circles, preparing for inheritance while their father still breathed. The empire William had built through conquest was dissolving before he died. Each fragment claimed by ambition and greed. In his lucid moments, he seemed to sense it. He asked that his sons be brought to him, but they were far away, each refusing to come first for fear of appearing weak. The conqueror who had forced kingdoms to kneel could not summon his own children to his side. When the pain grew worse, he begged the monks to move him, but every motion sent agony through his swollen abdomen. They tried to shift him gently, yet even the touch of cloth against his skin made him cry out. The infection had reached deep, and his belly had become a drum of trapped air and corruption. The physicians had no words for what they saw. They whispered that it was a punishment for excess, that the body of a glutton must burst like an overripe fruit. William heard them whisper, and a bitter smile touched his mouth. Then let it burst, he murmured, for it has feasted too long. On one of the final nights, a storm broke over the monastery. The thunder rolled like drums of war, and lightning flashed across the chamber, illuminating his face, grey and slick with sweat. The monks huddled in the corners, too afraid to leave, too horrified to stay. They said that in the flashes of light, his shadow seemed to move on its own, larger than life, crawling up the wall like the ghost of the warrior he had once been. Each crash of thunder made the walls tremble, and in the roar of the storm, the conqueror whispered to himself the only words that still mattered: not his victories, not his crown, but the sins he wished to unmake. When dawn returned, it brought no peace. His eyes were open but unfocused, his lips moving in prayer. The sunlight slipped through the shutters and fell upon his face, upon the cross resting on his chest, upon the silver plate that once held his food and now lay empty beside him. Outside, the bells rang for morning mass, but within the chamber, only the sound of his breathing remained shallow, ragged and fading. A monk leaned close to listen, thinking the end had come. But William stirred once more, lifting his hand a few inches from the bed, as if reaching for something unseen. Perhaps he was reaching for his sword, or perhaps for forgiveness. His fingers trembled, then fell, and the conqueror sank back into silence. Yet still he lived. Death seemed to hesitate, unwilling to take him quickly. There are some deaths that come like mercy, swift and clean, and others that linger, drawing the soul through every layer of suffering until it has nothing left but surrender. William's was the latter. He had fought every battle with the fury of a man certain of victory, and now death forced him to fight a final one he could never win. Each hour stretched into eternity, and the monastery became a place outside of time, where the line between the living and the dead blurred. And as the third night turned to the fourth, a strange calm fell over the chamber. The smell did not fade, nor the wounds heal, but something in him seemed to accept what had come. His body was ruined, his empire broken, his servants gone. Yet for the first time in all his years, he was still. The conqueror had stopped conquering. The war was over. Outside, the dawn broke over Rouen, soft and grey. The river below shimmered with the first light, and the bells began again. The monks knelt in their stalls and prayed, but none dared look toward the chamber. Within that room, behind the heavy wooden door, the once mighty king lay motionless, the silence of his breath nearly complete. But his story was not finished. For what came after the abandonment, the theft, the chaos of the funeral would prove that death, even when it finally came, could not restore the dignity that life had stripped away. The conqueror's last moments were only the beginning of his humiliation, and soon the world would learn that not even a king could control what happened to his body once his spirit had gone. The morning light crept slowly through the narrow window, soft and cold upon the chamber where William the Conqueror no longer stirred. The monks who had kept watch through the final night felt the air change before they were certain that the king had truly gone. It was not silence that told them, but stillness, a stillness that carried weight, that filled the room like a stone dropped into deep water. The rise and fall of his chest had ceased, and with it ended the voice that once commanded armies and reshaped nations. He had passed sometime near dawn, they said, as the bells of Rouen rang for morning prayers, and for a brief moment, the sound of those bells seemed to tremble in the heavy air, as though even they knew what had been lost. Yet what remained in that chamber was not peace. Death had not softened the horror that ruled the room. It had only made it final. The monks crossed themselves and whispered the prayers for the dead, but few could stay long enough to finish. The smell, unbearable before, had grown sharper in death. The infection that had eaten him from within had continued its work after life had gone, and the body of the great conqueror swelled grotesquely in the growing heat of the day. His face was discoloured, his skin stretched tight and waxen, his eyes half open as though even death could not make him close them. The odour seeped beneath the door, spreading down the corridors like a curse. One monk fainted as he tried to wash the body, and another vomited upon the floor before fleeing. The conqueror, who had been feared by men, now inspired only disgust and pity. For hours the corpse lay untouched. The few attendants who had remained until his last breath slipped away quietly, leaving only the monks to decide what must be done. Yet even among them, there was hesitation, for none dared to approach the body too closely. The priests argued in low voices about whether such a death was a sign of divine wrath, and some refused to perform the final rites at all, claiming that his sins had been too great and his end too unholy. The abbot, trembling, commanded that they obey their vows and bless the corpse, but he too covered his face as he entered the chamber, muttering the words of absolution from behind his sleeve. When the ritual was done, they left the room in haste, and for the rest of that day, the door remained closed, the conqueror's body left alone in the thickening air. Outside, the word of his death spread like wildfire. Couriers galloped through the streets of Rouen, carrying the news to Normandy and beyond, and within hours the sound of weeping mixed with the sound of opportunity. In the great hall, the nobles who had gathered to wait for the inevitable were already dividing his kingdom in whispers, each calculating what might now be theirs. Some spoke of loyalty and mourning, but more spoke of silver and titles. The sons of the king, still far apart, began to act as if their father had never lived. The throne he had built with blood was already splitting beneath their greed. Inside the monastery, the looting began. Servants who had once trembled before his authority now crept through the corridors, stealing what treasures he had left behind. A jeweled dagger vanished from the table, a ring from the bedside, a silver chalice from the altar where priests had prayed for his soul. The golden crucifix that lay upon his chest was gone before noon. No guard stopped them. No voice called them to account. The conqueror's power had dissolved as swiftly as his flesh, and in its place came chaos. When at last someone was sent to prepare his body for burial, the task was given to a group of hired embalmers, men paid to do what no loyal subject would. They entered the chamber reluctantly, clutching rags soaked in wine, and worked quickly, wrapping the body in linens drenched with spices to hide the smell. But nothing could stop the gases that had built inside him. The swollen abdomen strained against the bindings, and the embalmers, gagging, begged to be excused. They said the corpse was cursed, that to touch it was to invite ruin. In the end, they wrapped what they could, sealed the linens with wax, and stepped back in fear. The body that had once been too sacred for any commoner to gaze upon had become something no man dared approach. The funeral was meant to be grand, for William had founded the Abbey of St. Stephen in Caen and wished to be buried there. But even arranging the procession proved impossible. The nobles who should have accompanied the body were busy with their own ambitions. The priests hesitated, knowing the smell would follow them wherever the coffin went. It was left to a local knight named Horrifying to take charge, not from devotion but for the promise of gold. He ordered a lead coffin to be made, hoping the metal would contain the odour, and when the lid was closed, the relief in the monastery was almost holy. The chamber was scrubbed with vinegar and salt. The windows opened, but the air never fully cleared. The monks said that for weeks afterward, the scent of corruption lingered in the stones like an echo of the king's presence. When the funeral procession finally began, it was not the solemn march of a monarch but a desperate journey through the summer heat. The lead coffin was hauled onto a wagon, covered in black cloth, and drawn through the countryside towards Seine. Wherever it passed, people gathered to stare, but the air around it grew so foul that many turned away, covering their faces with their sleeves. Some threw flowers onto the path to mask the stench. Others crossed themselves and prayed that their own deaths would be kinder. Even the dogs that followed the wagon howled and refused to walk near. The Conqueror, who had once been cheered by soldiers and crowned by bishops, now moved through his kingdom like a plague cart, feared even in death. When they reached the town of Caen, the coffin was set aside while the church was made ready. But fate had not finished with William. A fire broke out in the streets that very afternoon, and the funeral had to be delayed while townsmen fought to extinguish the flames. The coffin remained in the sun, the lead growing hot, and the gases within continued to build. By the time the fire was put out and the procession resumed, the smell leaking from the seams of the coffin was so strong that even the clergy gagged as they entered the abbey. Still, duty demanded ceremony, and the bishops ordered that the service proceed. Inside the Abbey of St. Stephen, the stone walls glowed with candlelight, and the air was thick with incense. Nobles stood shoulder to shoulder, fanning their faces, pretending not to notice the odor that crept through the church. The priests spoke quickly, their Latin prayers stumbling over one another, their voices shaking. When the coffin was opened to transfer the body into the stone tomb prepared years before, the full horror was unleashed. The swollen corpse had expanded beyond recognition, and as the pallbearers lifted it, a sound like a sigh escaped from within. Some said it was the spirit leaving, others that it was the coffin groaning beneath pressure. But when they tried to lower the body into the tomb, it would not fit. The sarcophagus, carved decades earlier, when William had been lean and strong, was too small for the enormous, bloated shell he had become. They pressed harder, trying to force the body down. And then the inevitable happened. The stomach, stretched past its limit, burst open. A rush of foul air and black fluid filled the church, and the scent of decay rolled over the congregation like a wave. Bishops fled, nobles vomited, monks fainted, and the priests abandoned the ceremony in chaos. The church that had been meant to echo with hymns now rang with screams and retching. In that moment, all the glory of conquest, all the pride of kingship, dissolved into horror. And yet, even that was not the end. The few who remained worked in silence, sealing the tomb with haste, muttering prayers that sounded more like apologies. Outside, the sun sank behind the towers, and the people whispered that God himself had judged the king in the sight of all. The conqueror who had ruled 2 realms had been undone by his own flesh, and his funeral, meant to sanctify his memory, became a spectacle of divine retribution. The world had seen the mighty fall before, but never so completely, never so disgustingly. The power that had once bent nations to his will had finally turned against him. And in that moment, the age of the conqueror truly ended, not with triumph or prayer, but with the bursting of a body and the silence of shame. The abbey stood in uneasy silence long after the church had emptied, the walls still heavy with the scent of incense and corruption. The priests who had remained worked through the night, sealing the sarcophagus as quickly as they could, their hands shaking as they pressed mortar into the cracks. No hymns rose to the vaulted ceilings. No psalms of thanksgiving were sung. The funeral of William the Conqueror had ended not in majesty, but in panic, and the air that should have carried prayers for his soul was filled instead with the stench of decay. Even as dawn broke over Caen, the people avoided the abbey, afraid that the curse of the rotting king lingered within its stones. The conqueror, who had once made the world tremble, was at last silent, entombed, not in honor, but in disgrace. For a time, the monks tried to restore dignity to the story. They cleaned the floor where the horror had unfolded, burned spices and myrrh, and prayed for forgiveness. Yet the memory of that day refused to fade. They said that even after the tomb was sealed, A faint odour continued to seep through the cracks in the stone, that the air near it never seemed truly clean. The abbey became a place of uneasy reverence, part shrine, part warning. Pilgrims came from distant lands to see the grave of the man who had conquered England. But few lingered long. They would kneel, whisper a prayer, and leave quickly, their faces pale, as though they had seen something too close to judgment. The monks who guarded the tomb began to notice strange things. Candles burned lower near the stone coffin, and sometimes during night prayers, the flame would sputter and die without wind or movement. They spoke of noises that echoed from beneath the floor, faint, wet sounds, like water moving through stone, or the sigh of a buried man. Some swore that the tomb itself seemed to pulse faintly, as if the stone still remembered the bursting of the body within. In later years, stories would grow from these whispers, tales that the conqueror's spirit could not rest, that his soul was condemned to wander among the shadows of the abbey, forever searching for the peace he had denied others. The nobles who had fled the funeral never spoke of what they saw. In their letters and chronicles, they wrote of his death with measured words, omitting the chaos and the smell, describing only that the king had been buried with fitting ceremony. But truth is not so easily hidden. The servants who had attended the event carried the story into taverns and marketplaces, and soon the tale spread across Normandy and England that the conqueror's corpse had exploded before the altar, that his body had poisoned the very air of the church, that the hand of God had written judgment upon his flesh, and the people, who had lived for 2 decades under his heavy rule, nodded and said that justice had at last been done. In England, peasants told the story by firelight as a parable. The king who had starved the north had been starved of dignity in death. The man who had burned villages was himself consumed from within. In their telling, the story grew darker. More divine angels and demons were said to have fought for his soul. And when the demons won, his body swelled until it could no longer contain the weight of sin. Such tales took root and became legend, passed down from generation to generation, until William the Conqueror became not just a king, but a caution, a figure whose glory and downfall were bound together like fire and ash. Yet the truth, as always, was more human. The man who had once worn a crown of gold had died, terrified and alone, and the chaos that followed was not only punishment, but reflection of a world that worshipped power until power itself became a sickness. His sons, divided by ambition, soon fought over his legacy. Robert ruled Normandy with vanity and weakness. William Rufus held England with cruelty and fire, and Henry, the youngest, waited in the shadows for both to fall. Within a generation, the empire William had built began to crumble, undone, not by enemies from without, but by the very blood he had left behind. The conqueror's ghost, it seemed, had passed into his children restless, grasping, doomed to repeat the same hunger for control that had destroyed him. Back in Caen, the monks tended to the abbey as the decades passed, but the tomb never ceased to disturb them. Sometimes new brothers, unaware of its story, would light candles near it and feel a sudden dizziness, a faint nausea that sent them retreating. Others claimed that when they knelt before the grave, they heard whispers from the stone, not words, but a breath, a vibration deep within the earth. No one dared to open it again. The conqueror's name was spoken less with reverence than with unease. Even his victories seemed tainted, his castles and laws overshadowed by the image of that grotesque ending. The man who had shaped 2 kingdoms had left behind not unity, but unease. Centuries later, during the turmoil of war and Reformation, the tomb would be opened more than once each time, bringing new shame to the memory of the king. In the year 1522, workmen repairing the abbey disturbed his grave. and chroniclers wrote that what they found inside was not a body, but fragments scattered and darkened, as though time itself had refused to let him rest in one piece. During the religious wars of the 16th century, when hatred burned through France like wildfire, the abbey was stormed by men who called themselves reformers. They broke open the tomb, threw aside the remains, and trampled what was left of the conqueror's bones. Only one fragment, a thigh bone, was rescued by a frightened monk who fled with it beneath his robes. That single bone would later be placed in a new coffin centuries later. When the abbey was rebuilt, a grim reminder that even the greatest of kings can be reduced to less than a man. Modern historians would one day call William a builder, a lawmaker, a strategist. They would list his achievements, the Domesday Survey, the castles that still rise over England, the language forever changed by his conquest. Yet for all those accomplishments, it is his death that endures most vividly, because in that grotesque end, people saw truth made visible. The swelling, the bursting, the collapse of his body in a holy place. All these things became symbols of pride, meeting its own reflection. The medieval world believed that God had punished him, that his body had been made an instrument of justice. The modern world, wiser, but no less fascinated, sees in it a different lesson, that power itself carries the seed of its undoing. The man who believed himself chosen, unstoppable, eternal, was undone, not by sword or rebellion, but by the smallest of things, by the invisible life within his own body, turning against him with the patience of time. And perhaps that is why the story continues to echo through the centuries. It is not merely the tale of a death, but of the balance that lies beneath all ambition. Every throne, every empire, every monument to human greatness rests upon the same fragile foundation of flesh and bone. The conqueror's body was a kingdom unto itself, and when that kingdom fell, it fell in silence, so complete that the whole world heard it. The rot that began in his belly was not just a sickness, it was a mirror, showing the truth of all power, that nothing made by human hands can endure without decay. Even now, when travellers walk the quiet halls of St. Stephen's Abbey, they say the air feels colder near the tomb. The light dims a little, and the smell of incense lingers too long, as though memory itself refuses to leave. Beneath that stone lies what is left of a man who once thought himself larger than history, now reduced to dust and rumour. His kingdom has long since passed into other hands, his name carved on monuments and taught in books. But somewhere beneath the surface of every retelling lies the echo of that final moment in Cain, the bursting of a body, the gasp of horror, the flight of those who once adored him. And so his story stands as both warning and truth, that every conqueror is conquered in the end, not by enemies, not by rebellion, but by the quiet certainty that all flesh fails, that all crowns crumble, and that time itself has no master. The tomb that would not rest, the king who could not escape his own body, the empire that could not keep his memory clean, all of it remains, whispered by those who remember that history is not written only in victory, but in the silence that follows when power dies. Centuries moved like mist over Normandy, softening the sharp edges of war and fire, but the memory of the conqueror never vanished. His castles remained like teeth in the landscape. His laws endured in parchment and in practice. And yet, in every generation, when the tale of his death was told, listeners leaned closer, to their faces pale, not with admiration, but with fascination. Time had turned William's name into something more than history. It had become a myth of punishment. The man who had built empires through blood had been unmade by his own body. And in that ending, people saw something holy, something terrifyingly precise. as if the world itself had decided that no mortal could rise so high without being reminded of the dirt from which he came. The tomb in Caen, even sealed and silent, spoke more loudly than any sermon. It whispered through centuries of stone that power always decays from within. The monks who guarded the abbey learned to live with the story. Though they never grew used to it, pilgrims came, year after year, and each time they were told that the conqueror lay beneath their feet, a king reduced to dust, a skeleton that had once worn a crown. But the pilgrims never stayed long. They said the air near his resting place grew too heavy, that prayers sounded different there, that echoes lingered longer than they should. The brothers would light candles and tell themselves that it was imagination, that ghosts were for peasants and not for men of God. And yet sometimes, during matins, they would hear a faint tapping beneath the floor, as if someone deep below was still trying to command attention. As the Middle Ages unfolded, the story of William's death became a parable for priests and peasants alike. Preachers told it from pulpits as a warning to the proud, shaping it into a lesson about sin. They described how the conqueror's pride had swollen like his body, how his belly, filled with the hunger for dominion, had burst open so that the world might see the ugliness hidden within. The faithful shuddered, for they believed it true, and they repeated the story with every embellishment that time and fear could add. They said the stench at his funeral was the smell of damnation escaping into the mortal world. They said the church itself shook when his corpse exploded, as if God had struck the ground with disgust. Even kings who came after him listened with unease, for it was a reminder that the crown could not protect them from divine judgment. In England, where his name was written into law and legend, the tale drifted through the generations like smoke. Minstrels sang of his victories at Hastings. But when the fire dimmed and the night grew long, they spoke in lower voices of his death. They said his spirit wandered between England and Normandy, unable to rest, forever smelling of the corruption that had ended him. Some claimed that on certain nights, when the wind blew from the sea, the scent of decay drifted through the corridors of his castles, a ghost of the funeral that had shamed the living and silenced the bells. Whether true or not, the story clung to his memory like rot to bone, impossible to wash away. As centuries turned, kings rose and fell, empires shifted, faiths changed, and still, the conqueror's death remained an echo. When war came again to Normandy, and soldiers marched through Caen, some refused to camp near the abbey, muttering that the ground was cursed. And perhaps, in a way, it was. For the story of William's end had become more than legend. It had become a mirror of all human power. To rule, to conquer, to believe oneself above the limits of flesh, these were the first steps toward the same fall. His story endured because it spoke not just of one man's corruption, but of every man's. There are records from the 15th century that speak of nights when the monks heard voices near the tomb low, echoing, impossible to trace. They said that sometimes the stone covering the grave grew damp, as if sweating in the cold. The more devout believed it was the king's soul still seeking forgiveness. The skeptics believed it was the damp of the earth rising through cracks. But whether one saw miracle or mildew, the unease remained. The abbey was rebuilt, renovated, sanctified, and desecrated again by war and time. But the story never left it. Even when the tomb was broken open during the religious wars, when soldiers scattered the bones of saints and kings alike, people whispered that the conqueror's curse had escaped once more, unleashed into the world, like a wind that carried the smell of arrogance punished. In the years that followed, when France and England fought endless wars and the idea of kingship itself began to falter, poets remembered him differently. They no longer saw William as a hero. nor only as a tyrant, but as something deeper, a symbol of how greatness devours itself. The ink of history turned him into a metaphor. The conqueror who had shaped kingdoms now stood for the futility of power. Painters depicted him not as a warrior, but as a figure half buried in shadow. His crown slipping from his brow, his face pale with illness, his hand reaching for something beyond human grasp. They called such works the lesson of the conqueror, and scholars wrote that his life was the perfect tragedy, the rise of will, the fall of flesh, the silence of dust. And yet, even stripped of grandeur, there was something hauntingly human about him. In the long quiet after midnight, when the monks of Caen prayed alone, some said they could almost feel compassion for him, not for the king, but for the man, for the fear he must have felt as he lay dying, hearing his body betray him, for the loneliness of power that no crown could soothe, for the final humiliation of being left alone while his kingdom divided. Perhaps it was pity that kept his story alive. For what is more human than to fall? To be broken by the very thing one once controlled. Time continued its work. Indifferent and patient, the abbey weathered centuries of war, reform, and ruin. By the 19th century, the tomb was restored, the last surviving bone placed reverently within a new coffin, and a simple Latin inscription carved above, Hic sepultus est invictissimus Guilelmus Conquestor. Here lies the most invincible, William the Conqueror. Yet even those words could not cleanse the memory. Visitors stood before the stone, reading the epitaph, and felt something colder than reverence. They knew what the inscription did not say, that the invincible king had been conquered in the most human way imaginable. They stared at the slab of marble, knowing beneath it lay not triumph, but ruin. And they left in silence, carrying the ghost of that contradiction with them. Modern historians would later examine the story with the detached curiosity of science. They spoke of ruptured organs, of peritonitis, of bacterial infection spreading through a weakened body. They said it was not divine punishment, only medical inevitability. They were right. Perhaps, but in explaining the cause, they missed the meaning. For it was not only the bacteria that killed him, it was the truth he had built his life upon. That power could make a man greater than the laws of his own flesh. In the end, his death proved that belief wrong. The conqueror had built fortresses of stone and will trine to LibriVox. But the body, that fragile citadel of existence, had crumbled beneath him. And perhaps this is why the story still lingers, because it reminds us that even in our most magnificent moments, decay is already waiting. The crown that gleams today will tarnish. The hand that holds it will tremble. The voice that commands will one day fall silent. William's death is not only history but prophecy. It tells us that the body remembers what the soul forgets, that no victory erases mortality, and no conquest can save a man from himself. In the quiet of night, the abbey still hums with that truth. The stones breathe softly, and the air carries the faint scent of candle smoke and dust. Somewhere beneath, the conqueror sleeps or pretends to. His tomb is simple now, a relic of forgotten grandeur, surrounded by flowers that wilt faster than anywhere else in the garden. Visitors kneel before it, unaware of how close they are to the lesson that outlived the man. They leave their prayers, their coins, their curiosity, but the abbey remains indifferent. It has seen too many generations pass to be moved by another mortal's reverence. And so the legend continues, whispered not in fear, but in understanding. The tale of the conqueror who could not command his own flesh has become a mirror for those who rise too high, who believe their names can outlive decay. His body burst, his tomb was broken, his bones scattered, yet his story remains not as a monument of greatness, but as a confession carved into time. The conqueror was conquered, And in that final truth lies the only kind of immortality that matters, not the glory that endures, but the lesson that refuses to die. If one listens closely on a winter morning, when the bells of Cain toll through mist and the wind moves like breath over the stones, it is said that the faintest echo of his story can still be heard. Not the sound of war, nor the cry of triumph, but a quiete voice, older than pride, older than kingship, the voice that reminds all who rule, all who dream of greatness, that the flesh is the final battlefield, and that no crown, no sword, no empire can win against the slow, patient hands of time. Long after the conqueror's tomb was sealed and the air of Cain quieted, the story of his death refused to die. It clung to the living like smoke after a fire, seeping into every hall and whispering through the chambers of his children, who inherited not only his crowns, but the curse of his restless legacy. For though the body of William the Conqueror had burst and decayed in the Abbey of St. Stephen, the true corruption he left behind was not of flesh, but of blood. His sons Robert, William Rufus, and Henry carried within them the same hunger that had once driven their father to conquer kingdoms. Yet none of them inherited his strength, only his ambition. And in the years that followed his death, that ambition would tear apart everything he had built. The conqueror had subdued nations, but he had never learned to rule his own family. And when he finally surrendered to death, the sons he left behind were already unsheathing their knives against each other. Robert, the eldest, was meant to inherit Normandy, and he did so with the pride of one born first, but the weakness of one who had never truly fought alone. His father had long despised his softness, calling him lazy, indulgent, and easily swayed by flatterers. William Rufus, the second son, had inherited England, and with it the darker half of his father's nature, cunning, temper, and the ability to make men fear rather than love him. Henry, the youngest, was left only silver, but in that seeming slight lay the seed of destiny. For Henry had inherited his father's mind, cold, patient, and calculating. He would bide his time until both his brother's greed had burned itself out. Thus, the conqueror's empire was divided not by God's will, but by the rivalries of his own blood, a mirror of the decay that had consumed his body. The year after William's death, Normandy grew restless. Robert, beloved by the nobles for his charm and generosity, spent more time in revelry than rule. He opened his court to flatterers and fools, men who told him he was born for greatness, while emptying his treasury in the name of friendship. William Rufus, across the Channel, watched this with contempt, convinced that he, the stronger brother, should have inherited both realms. And so, while Robert drank and Henry counted his coins, William Rufus plotted. In the summer of 1088, he sent ships to Normandy, not to visit but to claim. He said it was to protect the land from rebellion. But everyone knew he came as a conqueror, not a brother. The smoke of burning villages once again stained the Norman sky, and the same people who had watched their king die of rot now watched his sons devour each other for what remained of his crown. The monks of Cain, hearing the distant thunder of war, said it was the conqueror's spirit, stirring beneath the stone. Unwilling to sleep, while his sons repeated his sins, they prayed that the fighting would end, but the prayers went unanswered. Brother turned against brother, and the lands that William had united through fear were divided again by that same fear. Robert's army faltered, and when he sought help from Henry, his youngest brother smiled and gave him only words. "The spoils of our father," Henry said, "belong to the one who can hold them." And with that, he closed his doors, counting his silver while his brothers bled. In England, William Rufus ruled with an iron hand. The courtiers feared his temper, the clergy despised his greed, and the people whispered that he was cursed. He built new castles and taxed the church until the bishops dared call him godless. Some said he dreamed of the day he could invade Normandy and make himself master of both crowns, completing the conquest his father had begun. Yet the more he ruled, the more his father's shadow darkened his name. He grew red-faced and swollen, like the old king had been, feasting and hunting while his subjects starved. And though he mocked the church, he feared death, feared it as a man fears his own reflection in the dark. There was a story told by the monks of St. Stephen's Abbey that one night William Rufus dreamed of his father standing at the foot of his bed, pale and bloated, his crown slipping from his skull. The ghost spoke not in words but in silence, pointing toward the heavens as if to say, "You will follow me soon." When the king awoke, his bedclothes were damp with sweat and the air in his chamber stank faintly of decay. He summoned priests to bless the room, and when they sprinkled holy water upon the floor, the drops hissed as though touching something unholy. From that night on, William Rufus refused to sleep alone. Yet no man escapes his fate. In the year 1100, while hunting in the New Forest, William Rufus was struck by an arrow. Some said it was an accident. Others said it was murder. But those who found his body swore that when they turned him over, the blood that poured from the wound was black as pitch. They buried him hastily at Winchester, without ceremony, and his younger brother, Henry, seized the crown before the body was cold. Thus the third son became king, as if the curse had waited for its last heir to show patience enough to claim it. Henry I, unlike his brothers, ruled with reason instead of rage. He strengthened England's laws, reformed its courts, and restored a measure of peace. Yet those who knew him closely said that he never smiled for long, that he was haunted by the memory of his father's end and his brother's greed. He avoided the Abbey of St. Stephen, though he sent offerings of gold to its altar, and he kept a priest always at his side to read prayers for the dead. His reign was long and measured, but not without sorrow. When his only legitimate son, William the Atheling, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, Henry wept not for the loss of an heir, but for the realization that his bloodline, which had fought so long and killed so many to preserve power, was doomed to fade. It was said that on the night he received the news, he locked himself alone in his chamber and spoke aloud to the darkness, saying, "So this is the end of conquest." And perhaps it was. For though the Norman line continued through Henry's daughter, Matilda, it never again carried the iron certainty of its founder. The descendants of the Conqueror fought each other, schemed against one another, and built kingdoms only to lose them again. The rot that had begun in William's body had passed into his blood, invisible, yet enduring. It whispered through the generations that followed, through kings and queens, through the rise and fall of dynasties. The same truth that his death had written upon history, that all power consumes itself. In time, the story of the Conqueror's sons became as infamous as his own. Chroniclers called them the inheritors of the rot, and poets wrote of their rivalry as if it were a curse carved into the crown itself. The church, eager for lessons, told their tale in sermons: a father's pride, a family's ruin, a warning that kingdoms built on ambition can never stand in peace. And when later kings read the chronicles of Normandy, they paused at the tale of the funeral, at the bursting of the corpse, at the silence of the abbey that followed, and they understood. For every ruler saw in William's death a reflection of his own, the reminder that even the mightiest will be reduced to dust and memory, their triumphs forgotten, but their failures eternal. Centuries would pass, and the sons of England would look back upon the conqueror with both awe and dread. The Norman castles became ruins, draped in ivy. The abbey bells dulled by time, yet the name of William still lingered like a shadow on the land. Historians would write of him as the man who shaped England, who changed its tongue and its fate. But beneath the ink, there remained the echo of the same stench that had filled the church in Caen, the unspoken knowledge that all greatness carries a cost. And in the quiet hours of the night, when kings could not sleep and priests prayed for mercy, the story of his sons reminded them that the curse of conquest is never buried with the conqueror. The wind that passes over Normandy today carries no scent of decay. Yet those who stand before the Abbey of St. Stephen sometimes swear they can still feel it faint but unmistakable. A whisper of the old air that once surrounded the dying king. The stone walls, aged and cracked, seem to breathe in rhythm with the bells. And beneath them lies the dust of a dynasty that tried to defy time and failed. The tomb does not move, but it remembers, and through its silence it teaches what words cannot, that power is not inherited, only borrowed, and that every son who dreams of wearing his father's crown must one day learn what the conqueror's sons learned too late, that no man can build an empire strong enough to contain his own mortality. And so, even now, as the centuries fade and names are forgotten, the story of William the Conqueror and his cursed heirs remains. It drifts through history not as legend alone, but as the quiet heartbeat of truth, that pride always outlives its purpose, that ambition always devours its own children, and that beneath every crown lies a skull waiting patiently to return to dust. The centuries rolled onward, like waves against the Normandy shore, and though the bones of the conqueror had long turned to dust, his shadow remained. The Abbey of St. Stephen, where the air once choked with the stench of death, now stood quiet beneath the weight of time. Moss climbed its stones, ivy wound itself along the arches, and the monks who prayed within its walls had forgotten the faces of kings. Yet they had not forgotten the story. It lingered like a taste that could not be washed away, a memory too heavy for history to bury. Travellers who came to Caen still asked to see the resting place of William the Conqueror, and the monks would guide them through the dim corridors toward the marble slab that marked the tomb. They would speak softly, not out of reverence, but as if raising their voices might wake something that should remain sleeping. Over the years, the abbey became a sanctuary not only for prayer but for curiosity. Scholars, pilgrims, and the superstitious all arrived with their own reasons, some to marvel, some to repent, some merely to feel the closeness of the man whose death had become legend. They would stand in silence before the grave, tracing the Latin inscription with their fingers, and many claimed they could sense a faint vibration through the stone, as though something still stirred below. When asked if the legend was true, the monks never lied, but they never told the full truth either. They would simply say that the earth beneath the abbey was restless, and that not all kings rest easily. The centuries were not kind to the tomb. War came again and again, changing flags but not fate. In the 15th century, the abbey survived the 100 Years' War. In the 16th, it barely survived the fires of religious reform. When the Calvinists stormed Caen during the Wars of Faith, they looted the abbey and shattered the graves of saints. They opened the conqueror's tomb and scattered what little remained. A monk named Brother Matthew wrote in trembling script that the bones were dark as burnt wood, brittle as shame, and that only one thigh bone was saved, hidden beneath the altar as the church burned. When the fire died and the soldiers left, the abbey was silent again. But the echo of that desecration seemed to linger in the very air. It was as if the humiliation of the king had been renewed, as if time itself took pleasure in reminding the world that even centuries could not grant him rest. For decades afterward, People claimed to see strange lights within the abbey. During storms, candles would flare without being lit. A shepherd passing by at dusk swore he saw a figure kneeling before the altar, its form indistinct, its face pale and swollen, weeping into its hands. The townsfolk said it was the Conqueror repenting for his pride. But others whispered that it was not repentance. He sought it was revenge. They said his spirit roamed the ruins, searching for the thieves who had scattered his bones, for the priests who had abandoned his grave, for the sons who had squandered his name. By the 18th century, the abbey was old and worn, but the legend had grown stronger. Historians argued over the truth, each retelling adding new layers to the myth. Some wrote that the bursting of the king's corpse had been exaggerated. Others claimed the event was divine punishment, a miracle of justice. Yet in every version, one image remained unchanged, the swollen king exploding before the altar, his death stinking of sin and retribution. It became a symbol larger than the man himself, a reminder of how thin the line is between power and decay. Painters rendered the scene in oils and frescoes, monks fleeing through incense smoke, bishops vomiting into their sleeves, the golden crown rolling across the floor like a fallen star. The abbey became both museum and mausoleum, a theatre of memory, where faith and fear performed together in eternal silence. When the 19th century arrived, restoration began. The abbey's walls were repaired, its roof renewed, and a new coffin was placed beneath the floor, containing the single surviving bone of the Conqueror, that lonely thigh. Rescued from the flames centuries earlier, the monks sealed it with prayer, as though a fragment of bone could reconcile the chaos of 1,000 years. They engraved a new inscription, Hic sepultus est invictissimus Guilhelmus Conquestor. But even as the letters were carved, the irony hung heavy in the air. Here lies the most invincible William the Conqueror, invincible, and yet defeated by decay, invincible, and yet reduced to a single bone, invincible, and yet remembered not for victory, but for the smell of his death. Visitors from across Europe came to see the restored tomb. They admired its simplicity, its symmetry, its cold elegance. Yet every scholar who stood before it felt something inexplicable, a heaviness in the lungs, a tremor in the voice, an awareness that the silence surrounding it was too perfect, too deliberate. Some said it was reverence, others, fear. For though the marble was new, the story beneath it had not changed. Beneath that single bone lay the entire weight of human vanity, the entire lesson of empire and flesh. And as the visitors turned to leave, they found that the sound of their own footsteps echoed strangely slower, deeper, as if the abbey itself were listening. When the 20th century came, and war once again swept across Europe, Caen became a battlefield. Bombs fell from the sky. Fire raged through streets. And for a time it seemed that nothing would remain. The abbey was struck. Its roof shattered. Its stained glass turned to dust. Yet somehow, miraculously, the tomb endured. Amid the ruins, the stone marking William's grave remained untouched, as though even destruction itself paused before it. The soldiers who entered afterwards spoke of a strange feeling in the air, a chill, a gravity, something that made them remove their helmets without knowing why. Some said it was luck, others said it was curse. But when the war ended and the abbey was rebuilt again, the people of Caen began to speak of the Conqueror's tomb not as a relic of pride, but as a survivor. It was during this period that the old story began to change shape. Historians softened the language, turned horror into lesson, replaced superstition with psychology. They said the Conqueror's death was no punishment, but an accident of the body, a tragic end to a brilliant life. They wrote books, held lectures, and described him in words that made him almost noble. Yet even then, when scholars spoke in calm voices of anatomy and infection, the audience always shivered. For beneath the layers of reason, the story still breathed. It was not the science that haunted them, but the symbolism, the idea that a man who had ruled through terror had been destroyed by something so small, so silent, so ungovernable. The abbey entered the modern age, its stones cleaned, its story commodified for tourists who arrived with cameras instead of candles. Yet the quiet within its walls remained untouched. Guides told the tale with theatrical restraint, and visitors listened, pretending not to be unnerved. But every so often, one would step back, touch the air, and whisper that it felt colder near the tomb. Children would tug at their parents' hands, asking why the candles flickered, even when no wind blew. And when they left, many would glance over their shoulders, as if afraid of turning their backs completely. It was not faith that held them, it was recognition. They sensed, without needing to be told, that this was not just the story of a dead king, but the story of every life that had ever tried to defy its own ending. At night, when the abbey was empty and the doors locked, the silence deepened until it felt alive. The moonlight slid across the stone floor like a pale ghost, and the shadows of the pillars stretched like fingers across the nave. The tomb gleamed faintly, and in that faint gleam, it seemed to breathe. Some said they could hear footsteps echoing between the walls, heavy and measured, as though someone were pacing the aisles. Others said that if one stood by the altar and listened very closely, a whisper rose from beneath the floor, not a voice, not a word, but a sigh. Perhaps it was memory. Perhaps it was history itself exhaling the story it could never forget. And so, as the modern world hums outside with noise and light, the Abbey of St. Stephen remains a world apart, a sanctuary of decay turned into eternity. The conqueror who once burned cities now guards silence. The king who once wielded the sword now commands only stillness. And yet, in that stillness, he endures more powerfully than any living ruler. His death became the sermon that never ends. The truth that time refuses to erase, that every throne is borrowed, every triumph fleeting, every body mortal. The marble above him does not speak, but if it could, it would whisper the words that history learned from his fall, that to conquer the world is easy, but to conquer the self is impossible, and that even kings, when they try to outlast the grave, become their own ghosts. The night settles softly over Caen, wrapping the abbey in the silver hush of moonlight. The streets outside are empty now, and only the faint tolling of a distant bell reminds the world that time still moves forward. Within those ancient walls, where monks once fled from the stench of a dying king, there is nothing left but quiet. The candles burn low, the air smells faintly of wax and stone, and somewhere beneath the marble floor, the last remnant of William the Conqueror sleeps. No longer the ruler of nations, no longer the voice that ordered the burning of cities, but only a trace of what was once flesh and fire, a memory preserved in dust. And yet, even now, after almost 1,000 years, his story breathes, soft and slow, like the rhythm of a world that never fully forgets. If one listens closely, the silence tells it all. The stone holds every echo. The walls remember every prayer and every whisper. The abbey has seen kingdoms rise and fall, seen war burn across the hills, seen the faces of countless men who came to stare at the grave of the conqueror and leave with a shiver in their souls. But tonight, there is no fear left here. Only stillness. The ghosts have grown tired, and even the restless spirit of the king has quieted. The centuries have worn down his anger, polished his pride into something like humility. In this calm, he is no longer William the Conqueror. He is only William, a man who once lived too fiercely and learned too late that even the fiercest flame cannot burn forever. The moonlight rests on the marble like a hand in blessing. It has touched so many graves before this one. And it knows the truth that William never did that. The light which falls on kings and beggars is the same. And that time erases the borders that power builds. Once, his name had shaken empires. Once, his shadow had stretched from Normandy to the green hills of England. But the years have thinned that shadow into a thread of memory, faint and trembling. What remains is not his empire, but his lesson. For the world has always been a patient teacher, and it taught him through pain, through decay, through the slow unraveling of his own body, that no man, however mighty, can command the clock or the grave. It is strange how quiet the truth sounds when finally spoken. The monks who walk these halls no longer fear the tale of the bursting body or the smell of rot. They have come to see it as something gentler, not a curse, but a confession. For William's death was not punishment alone. It was the natural end of a man who had tried too long to live above nature. In his agony, there was understanding. In his silence, there was acceptance. And now, in the still air of the abbey, that acceptance has settled like dust, covering everything in the same calm that follows surrender. Outside, the wind moves through the garden, brushing the grass that grows above the old foundations. The roses lean toward the moonlight, and the earth beneath them holds the stories of all who came before monks, soldiers, kings, and strangers who stopped to pray. Each one, for a moment, believed themselves separate from time, and each one, in the end, became part of it. Perhaps that is what William knows now. In whatever realm holds what remains of him, that time is not an enemy but a kind of mercy. It softens even the hardest of legacies. It turns blood into soil, anger into echo, and names into lullabies. And so his story, once told in fear and judgment, has become something else, a tale not of horror, but of humility. The man who ruled through terror has become a teacher in silence. The king who once believed himself chosen has become a reminder that no one is chosen for long. His greatness, like the empire he built, has dissolved into history's sea. And what remains is what remains of everyone. A trace of breath, a ripple of memory, a faint warmth that refuses to disappear. The abbey itself seems to understand this. Its stones are worn but still standing. Its bells still ring, though no one hears them in the same way anymore. It has become less a monument to power than to endurance. In its quiet, one can feel the steady heartbeat of time itself. Unhurried, unbending, eternal. And somewhere within that heartbeat lies the story of the conqueror, not in the sound of battle or the thunder of horses, but in the soft exhale of forgiveness. For perhaps even William, in the last moment before his breath ceased, felt it, the gentle touch of grace that comes not from victory, but from letting go. When the monks rise for their midnight prayers, they move through the shadows like ghosts themselves, their footsteps echoing softly. They do not look toward the tomb as they pass, but they bow their heads slightly, not in fear, but in remembrance. For in their hearts they know that beneath the marble lies the same truth that will one day claim them all, that flesh fails, that crowns crumble, that the soul outlasts its name. They whisper the ancient words, Requiem aeternam, dona ei, Domine. And though they mean them for William, the prayer belongs to every life that ever burned too brightly to last. The night grows deeper, the wind slows. The candles in the nave flicker and die one by one. leaving only the moonlight to wander across the floor. It pauses over the tomb, then moves onward, climbing the columns, touching the vaulted ceiling before vanishing into the darkness above. And in that quiet moment, it is easy to believe that something of the Conqueror still lingers here, not as a ghost or a curse, but as a whisper, a presence as faint as breath on glass, not to frighten, not to boast, but to remind the living that victory is fleeting, that the body is fragile, and that even the greatest story ends in silence. Outside, the River Orne moves gently under the bridge, carrying the moon's reflection downstream. The water has seen everything: the fires of conquest, the blood of battle, the rebuilding, the ruin, and now the peace. It carries all of it without judgment. And perhaps that is how time itself moves, not cruelly, not kindly, but simply onward, erasing nothing, forgiving everything. If William's spirit still walks beside it, it must be quiet now. No longer a king or a ghost, but something smaller, something freer, a ripple among many. At last, a part of what he could never command. In the end, his story is not about death at all, but about release. The bursting of his body, the scattering of his bones, the centuries of unrest, all of it was merely the long process of surrender. Power had been his prison, and time, his captor, but in the slow unraveling of all he built, he found the peace that conquest never gave him. The lesson he leaves behind is simple, and in the stillness of the abbey, it sounds almost like a lullaby. It says that all things return to quiet, that every empire dissolves into dust, that even the fiercest heart must one day rest. So sleep now, William. The wars are over. The bells have rung their last. The world you tried to command has moved on without you. Yet your story remains, not as a crown or a curse, but as a whisper carried on the breath of time, a reminder to those who come after that greatness fades. Pride softens, and the only victory worth keeping is the peace that waits beyond all struggle. And to you, dear listener, as this story closes and the night deepens, may that same peace find you. May you feel the stillness that William never knew in life, the quiet acceptance that comes when the battle ends, when the body rests, and when the soul, at last, stops fighting the clock. The Conqueror has found his silence. Let us do the same.